this is going to be especially true for me today as well, since I get to introduce our next speaker, Marsha Kelly. And your program has a nice description of her background and the wonderful things that she's done in the area of communications and media. But I want to tell you some personal anecdotes about my meeting with Marsha. And she's had some impact on this area that she's probably not even aware of. So it was in the mid-'80s or so when we were all children, and I was at Berkeley and was starting a group to try to deal with the animal rights activists. And we had no idea what to do because we were scientists and we were in our labs and doing our work and, curing ills and so forth. And we got a phone call from a group that was representing the Fur Animal Welfare Coalition. And they were giving a presentation on animal rights movement and their impact on human society. And they wanted us to come down and talk about biomedical research. And we looked at each other and said, ooh, the fur people. We're going to work with the fur people? I don't know what. And then we thought, well, we probably should all get united on this, so let's go find out. So I went to give this talk, and boy, did I learn that we have to take the bull by the horns and address the basic philosophy of the animal rights movement and not get out there and be apologists or make excuses and play their game, fall into the trap of answering these absurd claims. And I learned that from this lady right here a long time ago, and I took that to places in California, and places in New Jersey, and many places around the country, and into Canada as well. And I don't think I would have really understood that message if it weren't for Marsha Kelly. So she really taught me a lot, and then I used that to teach an awful lot of other people as well. And then the other terrific thing that Marsha Kelly did was introduce me to Patty Strand. So I owe a lot to this woman who's one of my personal heroes. And I need to just stop for 1 second and look at this table, because this is a really nice moment for me, because two of my personal heroes are to my right, and I've never actually been in the room with the two of them together. So hold on a second, I need to savor this. Okay, that was very good. I don't know about you, but I got a nice little tinkle. So anyway, I am delighted to turn the podium over to Marsha Kelly, who I hope is, as a terrific teacher, is going to provide some very useful information for us today. Marsha, welcome.
Thank you, Larry. If he hadn't moved away so quick, I would have pinched his little cheek. He's so cute. I knew him before he had gray hair. He was just a little whippersnapper professor, a little pointy-headed academic, but really got it. And that's why I feel so honored. And I haven't seen Larry in, at least 5 or 6 years. So this is just such a treat, not only to see him, but to be actually introduced by him. And I'm honored. Thank you that you would do that. That was very sweet. And actually, I share Larry's perspective about Patty. Patty really is one of my heroes, because not only was she one of the first people back in the early 90s when I started working on this issue, the late 80s, early 90s, she was one of the few people that understood what it meant to take this animal rights movement on and how to challenge their value system and their agenda. Not only was she one of the few people that got that, but she is the most persistent and tenacious human being I have ever known. I mean, I have suffered from burnout, and I think we all have those moments of burnout. Patty never seems to get that. Patty just keeps going, and every time I talk to her, she's more excited about how things are going and how her organization is growing. And when I think back to the very humble beginnings of NAIA and how Patty and her husband Rod have, and all of you, as you've gotten involved and begun to give your considerable talent and effort to the project, it just amazes me how far NAIA has come, and that is in such large measure due to Patty's tenacity and persistence and refusal to ever give up and refusal to burn out. And for that, my dear, I so salute you. Patty gave me a lot of time on this program today, and you're going to be really sick of hearing from me, I have no doubt, by the end of the day. I hope that it is some compensation to know that at the end of the day, hopefully you'll go away with some good solid meat and potatoes techniques and strategies for planning your media campaign, for utilizing media tools that are available to you, for defining your message, and for being an effective source of information about your business and about animal use. That is my goal by the end of the day. So hopefully this will be a lot of nuts and bolts that you can use. If this is, too elementary for some of you, if some of you have kind of already passed this in terms of your knowledge level, I apologize, and I hope that you'll bear with me, because according to what Patty told me about this audience, this is the kind of stuff that a lot of you want to hear. So I'm hoping that I don't bore those of you who are way ahead of me, and I hope that I give the rest of you the information that you feel that you need. I'm going to pour myself a little water here. So we're going to start talking about getting your message out using those basic media relations tools that are available to you. And the way this is going to progress, there is a logical flow to this. If you kind of just follow my version of logic, probably not Aristotelian, but my version of logic. We're going to start out just talking about some of the basic tools that are available to you for getting your message out in the media. And I'm going to focus on media today and not talk about all the other many ways of getting your message out, setting up displays and doing exhibits and doing parades and stuff like that. We're going to focus on media. Then we're going to talk a little bit about planning your media campaign. In other words, once you sort of know all the tools that are out there, how do you plan your media campaign so that you sort of know what you want to do, when you want to do it, why you want to do it, and how you want to do it. And then this afternoon, we're going to go into the specifics of defining your message, focusing on your message, maintaining focus in interview situations, sort of the mechanics of interviews. So hopefully by the end of the day, you'll have a big picture. So let's talk about getting your message out. These are just the basic tools. And number one rule, forget the technology. Most Americans get their news from these sources, and when you look at this, what becomes immediately clear to you is the importance of your local media. And that is one of the things that I've learned over the years. We all want to be on CNN. I wish I had a nickel for every time someone has said to me, we ought to be getting 60 Minutes to cover this, or we ought to be getting 2020 to cover this. That's pretty tough. And usually that doesn't happen until there's a really, really big issue that attracts national attention. But in the meantime, we labor in the local vineyards. That's what we do. And we use local media to get our message out. 71% of the people in America get their news from local television. They're watching local TV before they're watching the network evening news. So going after your local media is really where we all start. 71% local news, 54% local newspaper, and then look at the internet. The internet has become a humongously significant news source. Never underestimate the value of the internet in getting your message out. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you do that, some of the ways that are available for you to do that. Also, I should mention, I did not print out handouts because of some technological glitches last night here in the Business Center, but I'm going to give all this material to Patty, and she will be able to post it online so that you can all access it. And if there's a difficulty, then I'll be glad to email you all this stuff, so you'll have access to it. But this is really important. Those top three are really important. And then you have the network news, the Fox, the CNN, the morning shows, National Public Radio, but all those national media, people don't really rely on them to the extent that they rely on their local news outlets and the internet. So keep that in mind as you begin thinking about how to get your message out. Is your message news? That's one of the first questions we have to ask. Unfortunately, we all sort of buy into the truism that it isn't news unless it's bad news. And unfortunately, that's pretty much the case, particularly the way the media function today. Now think about this, because people always say to me, why can't we get them to cover the good news? Well, look at that first criterion. This is the first measure that a news person, a reporter, looks at to figure out whether or not they want to cover your story. Is it unusual? Now, follow me here, because this is going to sound convoluted, but it really makes sense. Our message is the majority of people who are in animal use enterprises, whether you're a pet breeder or a medical researcher or a fur farmer or a hunter or a trapper or whatever, the majority of people in our business do the right thing, treat animals in the right way, are conscientious in their duties when it comes to animal care. That's the usual. Now, we know the media are looking for the unusual. Ergo, logic says, most of the time they're going to cover the bad guys and not the good guys. If the good guys are usual, and our message is the good guys are the usual, the bad guys are going to get the coverage, okay? So that answers the question, why do they always cover the bad news? And that answers the question, why is it so hard to get coverage of the good news? So you have to find a unique angle. If there's a unique angle, that will increase your chance of coverage. But just because you're doing a good job and you want the media to cover that, their assumption is, yeah, that's usual. The second question that a reporter is going to ask after they decide whether or not your news is unusual, they're going to ask, how many people does it affect? The more people it affects, the bigger the news. If there's a thunderstorm and one guy's house gets struck by lightning, yeah, that might make the news, it might not. If there's a thunderstorm and a tornado comes through and a community is wiped out, that's news because a lot of people are affected. So as you think about whether your message is newsworthy, think about how it affects people and how many people it affects. For example, when you're talking about changes in ordinances that regulate how people own pets or cull pets or treat pets, that affects a lot of people. If you've got a position on an issue like that, that's going to be newsworthy because a lot of people are going to be affected by that issue. If it affects only you and one or two other people on the planet, it's going to be hard to generate much media interest in that. And then, of course, the obvious question, how does it affect them? Why should the audience care? Why should the media care? Because of how this is going to affect people. It's going to make it harder for people to own pets, or it's going to make it much more difficult for medical researchers to do the jobs that save lives, and so on. So think about testing your message against these three criteria. Is it unusual? How many people does it affect? How does it affect them? If you look at your message in that context, you're going to understand right off the bat what's newsworthy and what isn't. So once you've kind of figured out whether or not your message is newsworthy, and we're going to talk about message development later, so we're kind of talking mechanics and logistics now, not really content. When we talk about getting your news, using the news media to get your message out, we're talking about in print media, on television, on radio, and on the internet. And I said, as I said earlier, because we're focusing on media, we're not going to talk about other non-media, non-electronic ways of doing that. Now, getting your message out in print. I have a pro-print bias. And maybe this is because I've always been on the public relations side of the business. I really appreciated hearing Richard's comments this morning from the advertising perspective, because that's not an area where I consider myself to be particularly knowledgeable. But on the public relations side, I've always felt like print was a really good opportunity for people with the kind of stories that we have. Because print exposure allows you usually to get a little more detailed about the issue. I mean, television is so encapsulated and so brief. I read somewhere that in TV, and we'll get to this in a minute, but in TV, in presidential elections, in 2000, the average presidential candidate soundbite was 14 seconds. And now that presidential soundbite in this election cycle is down, when the candidates speak, that's down to 8 seconds. So if a candidate for President of the United States and leader of the free world is getting 8 seconds to say what he has to say about saving the planet, the odds are that you and I are not probably going to get a heck of a lot more than that. So anyway, that's why I have a bias in favor of print. So the standard tools, and again, you know, this is basics. This is kind of the meat and potatoes. The standard tools for getting your message out in print. You've got news releases and media advisories. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between those. You've got op-ed pieces on the editorial page. You've got letters to the editor, which is a great tool, and we all know the importance of getting those letters out. Editorial briefings, which is sitting down one-on-one with an editor or an editorial team. And then we've got reporter meetings, which are another good way to get your message out. And particularly in local settings with your local newspaper reporters, the people who are covering your issues, it's easy, they're very accessible. All right, news releases. Why would you issue a news release? Well, you might introduce a new product or a program. You might announce personnel changes. Maybe your executive staff has changed, your president has changed. You might want to promote the receipt of an award or a grant. You might want to respond to current events. For example, if there is an initiative or a referendum or an ordinance being proposed in your community, you might want to issue a news release to take a position on that issue. You might want to announce an upcoming event and try to generate some awareness of an event that's coming up. And you might want to make a report on actions taken. In other words, at our annual meeting, we did this and this and this, and this is why it's important. So those are just a few of the occasions that might make a news release appropriate. In terms of getting the news release out, and this is just sort of a general overview, we'll go into more detail, but one of the things that's changed in the last few years, when I was a young whippersnapper, just in the early stages of my PR career, shortly after the Civil War, I used to spend many hours putting labels on envelopes and stuffing envelopes to send out news releases. Those days are pretty much gone, hopefully forever. Although I do seem to spend an inordinate amount of time stuffing envelopes. I'm not really sure what that's about, but nowadays reporters prefer email. And the reporters, in the vast majority of cases, don't even look at their snail mail for days and days and days. So email is the best way. Very occasionally you'll get a reporter or an editor that prefers faxes, and you can certainly accommodate that, but for the most part, email is the preferred delivery method these days. And most websites, media websites, will tell you how to get news into the news department. They'll have a couple of contact names and emails so that you know who to contact, and if you don't, just call them up and ask them. Yeah.
When it comes to an adversarial group, do you have hacking issues?
You mean as far as intercepting emails?
Interfering with them, yeah.
I've never had that happen. Generally, when I send emails to a reporter, and we'll talk about attachments because that can be a complication, but generally speaking, I've never had that happen.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not to say it couldn't.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Are 400 words about one page?
Yes.
I never counted every little word.
Yes, yes. And in fact, we'll talk a little bit, the 400 words is the best length, and that is basically one page, but keep in mind, if you're emailing a news release, it's really not going to matter what a page is, per se, you know, but 400 words is the best length.
Now, is email best or the preferred method for an op-ed letter or a letter to the editor?
Yes, yes. Email is best all the way around, because that's easier for them to read, and it's much more timely. As I said, fax is okay as an alternate or a backup if they request it. Sometimes, for example, if you're concerned about, for example, the hacking issue, you might send the email and then you might send a backup copy by fax just to make sure that they got it. And you know, sometimes email goes down. I mean, I wish I had a nickel for every time my email has just disappeared. When I got my new Mac and I was transferring all my data from my PC to my Mac, and like Larry knows, I'm really impaired on this stuff. I mean, all my email just disappeared. It went away. I don't know where it went, so that can happen too. So sometimes, you know, backing up with a fax is a good thing.
Now, it's interesting that the media prefers email, but in my experience, elected officials, legislators prefer snail mail.
That's because they only get it 4 weeks later after it's gone through the ad.
No, I'll tell you the reason. I'll tell you the reason why. Actually, there's a reason why elected officials prefer that, and Cindy might be partly right, but the other issue is that elected officials like to be able to make a copy of a document that has a nice little heading on it and maybe some letterhead, so that they can put it in their little folder, so that if somebody comes and says, why did you vote this way on an issue, they can pull out their little folder and say, well, look at all these letters I got. And they know that email is very easily orchestrated, you know, and for example, now they have these websites where you can basically just, you know, you just fill in the blanks and you push the button and the email goes in. Well, elected officials know that that's just sort of a big orchestrated thing. That's not individual constituents. So they tend to like those handwritten letters or those personal letters more, because then they know that that is from a person. It might have been orchestrated, but it's a lot less likely that people who are actually taking the time to write and send a letter have been orchestrated under some big, massive plan. So there is actually a legitimate reason for that. What is important, though, is never send your news release as an attachment. most of the email programs and systems are set up at the major media outlets and even smaller newspapers to screen out attachments so that they avoid viruses. It's a protection for them, a security issue for them. So always embed your email in the text of your message. 400 words is the best length. Now that's not to say that you can't write it longer if you have to. But generally speaking, 90% of what you have to say ought to be able to be said in 400 words. And if it's not, it means that you're not editing, because you need to be your own best editor. If you don't want them to decide what's important, then you need to decide what's important. And you need to write clearly and concisely so that it's very difficult for them to edit something out without really taking something away from the release. So try for that 400-word thing. Now in op-ed pieces, and we'll talk about those later, there's a little different standard that applies. And a consistent recognizable format. In other words, even though you're embedding your text, you should always try to do it in the same way so that when people get an email from you with a news release, they can see at a glance that it's from you. This is sort of the public relations equivalent of branding. As Richard was talking about earlier, it's nice for people to be able to just look at the email and say, oh, I've got a news release from NAIA. And when they look down the body of the copy, they'll be able just to see by the way it's written and by the way it's formatted that that is NAIA. It makes it a little easier. Now, getting into the specifics of news releases. How many of you have had to issue news releases? Did you find it difficult, or was it pretty easy? Did you have questions about formats?
I took journalism 101, so.
Well, you got it then. We'll just go over some of the sort of, again, the mechanics. You're always going to want to put a release time and date. Now, if you want it to go out right away, or if there is no particular time constraint on the news release, then just say for immediate release at the top of the news release. And all that tells the reporter is, you can send it out now if you want to. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. Sometimes if it's not time sensitive, it'll sit for 2 or 3 days before they might use it. But if it doesn't really matter when they use it, put it for immediate release. You can also do an embargo. And embargoing just means basically that you ask the media to hold on to your news release until a specific time. Now the reason that you might do that, I'll give you an example. Let's say that we're putting out a news release about this conference and we say, Richard Earle is going to make a major speech about how he thinks that today's advertising sucks. and that's going to happen at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. Well, you don't want to really say too much about that until it actually happens. In other words, if you put the news release out and there's information about what Mr. Earle actually said, and then Mr. Earle fell off the bus on the way to the speech and didn't make it because he had to go to the hospital, then you look kind of foolish because you put out a news release about an event that didn't happen. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's why you might want to embargo. And if you're putting out something about an event and what happens at the event, you're gonna put on that news release embargo until 10 a.m. Sunday, because by then either he will have made his speech or you'll know enough to be able to pull it and to call the media back and say, oh geez, the guy fell off the bus, didn't give a speech, sorry about that, throw the release in the garbage. So you can do the embargo, but that can be tricky because the media will try to honor that, but sometimes it just falls through the cracks and it doesn't get honored. So I have never really liked to use the embargo as a tool, but you can do it if it's important to you. Make sure that you include all the contact information so that a reporter who's interested can contact you. Your name, your title, what role you play in the company or organization, the phone, email, website, contact information. A lot of times a reporter, before they call you, if they're looking at your release, will say, I'd like to know more about this organization before I talk to the person. So they'll go to the website and they'll look for information on the website. So it's good to have that information available to them. Then you're going to have your headline. Now keep in mind, when we write a headline on a news release, that doesn't mean that headline is going to get used, because editors write the headlines, or in very major newspapers, headline writers write the headlines. And the headline writers, when they write the headlines, look at the first 2 sentences of the story, maybe the lead paragraph, and the last paragraph, and from those 2 pieces, they assume that they know enough about the story to write the headline. This explains why many times the headline doesn't match the story. Because they don't read the story. They only only read the first two paragraphs, if that, or the first and the last paragraph. So you can write a headline, they may not use it, but at least if you write the headline, they're going to understand how you're positioning the event, and that may be helpful to them. So you want to get your primary news hook into that headline. Then a subhead. Now some reporters really appreciate having a subhead underneath the headline that gives them a little bit more information about what's happening. So your headline may be NAIA conference to feature national advertising expert. And your subhead might be Richard Earl, architect of Iron Eyes America's Beautiful campaign to address NAIA. So that way you've got a little bit more of the really important information into that headline and the subhead. Now you don't need to include that subhead if you don't want to, but if you want to, it's a good way of getting reporters, giving them a little more information and hopefully attracting them into the rest of the news release. And of course, then you're going to have your dateline, the city and the state where this news is emanating from and the date that the release is being issued. Then, of course, your lead paragraph, and that's got to be your grabber. Your lead paragraph has got to grab that reporter and get him into the news release so that he or she really is drawn by what you say and wants to know more. And that's just who, what, when, where, why. Who is involved, what are they talking about, or what are they doing, when are they going to do it, where are they going to do it, and why are they going to do it. And your lead paragraph has got to answer those 5 questions. If it doesn't, it's unlikely that the reporter is going to go very further because they don't have much time. Their time is very limited. And in today's environment, reporters have even less time because so many newspapers are in such financial trouble that they're cutting staff. So the easier you can make a reporter's job, the more work you can do for them, the better off you're going to be. So you've got your lead paragraph done, then you're going to go into the body of the news release. Just 2 to 3 paragraphs. Relevant info on the content that you're trying to deliver, just as clear and crisp as you can make it. Keep in mind that a news release is not a marketing document. There is no room for a lot of adjectives. This is news writing. This has to be appealing to a reporter. This is not writing a 60-second commercial for pizza sauce. So keep in mind that your language has to be, as a reporter would write it, balanced, fair, not necessarily neutral because you want to position yourself, but you want to position yourself in language that's very moderate and reasonable and not hyperbolic. No exclamation points in news releases. There is no crying in baseball. There is no exclamation point in news writing, okay? No, none of that hysterical stuff. Quotes are good. Every news release is going to have a quote, or 1 or more, sometimes even 2, from either a representative of the organization, an industry expert, a satisfied customer who wants to give a testimonial, and you need to make sure that you fully identify those quotes, who those people are, and what their relationship is to the organization. You always want to avoid lingo, jargon, technical terms. I remember doing some work for a client in the energy business. They're a co-op, major utility co-op in my area, and I was writing a news release about their annual environmental report, which is a report that has to be submitted under state law. And so they sent me, the data that they wanted included in the news release, and it was, the ERS for 2006 included a PIY summary as well as an RLH summary, and the co-manufacturing and co-generation factors and the scrubbers, and I said, what the hell does this mean? This is not English. You need to talk in English. So make sure that you do not fall into that trap of throwing in, and I'll tell you what, lingo, jargon, technical terms, doesn't have any room. I remember when I started working for the Greyhound industry, that's one of my clients, Greyhound Racing. And they would talk about the bitches. Yeah. Perfectly standard response. Anybody in the pet business is very comfortable with that language. But I said, when we're writing news releases and when we're making public comments and when we're doing interviews, we do not talk about bitches. We talk about females. I get it, but you can't sell it. It's not going to play in Peoria. So we gotta be a little more careful. Don't engage in that lingo and jargon, technical terms. People don't get it. They need to understand in plain old English. And then the news release is gonna wrap up with a summary sentence or two, just kind of restating the issue. And then oftentimes you'll want to include what we call a boilerplate company description. Your boilerplate paragraph is a paragraph that you put at the end of every news release you ever send out. And it will say something like, NAIA is the national organization representing diverse animal interests from animal breeding and agriculture to medical, blah, 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 right after. But it's one paragraph, it's always the same, it never changes, and it tells who you are in a very clear and succinct way. So that boilerplate paragraph always goes at the end of your news release. Now, once you've got the thing written, how do you get it out? Timing is important. Wednesdays and Thursdays are the best days to issue news releases because those are the days when the media are really looking for news. Usually Mondays and Tuesdays are quite busy because of the weekend and because of the limited coverage that's available on the weekend. I mean, newspapers are barely staffed, TV stations are very minimally staffed. So everybody waits until Monday, to do their major news events, unless news happens, which of course it does, but if you've got control, Wednesday or Thursdays are the best days because you've got a better chance of getting consideration, getting people to actually take a look at it. If you can piggyback on a popular current topic, that timing becomes beneficial to you. For example, as I said, if some ordinance has been introduced at a Monday meeting of the city council, you might want to put something out right away on Tuesday because it's timely. So, don't get obsessed with the Wednesday or Thursday thing. If a current event gives you an opportunity to put it out when it's timely. Avoid competing with major news. For example, if you know that a major building is going to be dedicated or the president is going to be in your area, don't be sending out a news release at that time because it'll get buried. Nobody will notice it. Just hold off, and unless it's really, really, really urgent and you can't do it any other time, avoid competing with that major news development. Just wait until things settle down. For the most part, it's good to put the release out earlier in the day to maximize coverage and to maximize pickup. In other words, if you put a news release out at 10 o'clock in the morning, not only is it going to hit afternoon papers, it's going to hit radio broadcasts probably from noon on, and it's going to hit TV broadcasts from noon on. So the earlier you put it out in the day, the more likely it is that it's going to get play throughout the day. Whereas if you put it at 4 o'clock, you might even miss the early news in the evening, and you might not get any play at all until 10 o'clock at night. So generally speaking, try to get the news release out early in the day to maximize the impact. Yes. The early bird definitely gets the worm. After you've got the news release issued, then you want to call to verify that they've received it, and that's a good opportunity to double check that it hasn't been, diverted by some whacked out animal rights person with a little hacking tool. So you call to verify the receipt of the news release. If they haven't gotten it, then you can fax a backup copy. Offer any additional information or assistance. Now generally, if you ask a reporter or an editor, are you going to use the news release? They're going to say, I don't know. We'll see. Maybe, maybe not. So there isn't much point in trying to press them about whether or not they're going to use it. Just offer any, is there anything else that I can tell you? Is there any other information that you would like that would help you write a story if you're going to write a story? And let them know that you're available to give them additional information. And then just keep your eye open to see whether or not it airs. Now, one thing you should remember, oftentimes they won't use your release as a separate entity. But if they're covering the story that relates to what you have to say, they'll take a quote or two from you, they'll take a little piece of your news release, and they'll plug it into some larger story. So you might see a big story on the pet breeding ordinance, and that may have come just because a reporter was covering the issue, and if you look in that story, oh, for heaven's sakes, there I am. They pulled my quote out of my news release and used it. That's a good thing. So don't be upset that they didn't use it your way. They used it. That's the key. It's important that we work hard to develop our own media contact lists in our local markets. As you know, these local markets, particularly smaller markets, there's a lot of turnover because the smaller markets are training grounds basically for the larger markets. And whether you're working in print or TV, what you're going to find is that a lot of these reporters are around for a year or two, and then they go someplace else, and you've got somebody new that comes in. So it's really important for you to develop and maintain your own media contact list. The editors that are covering the topics that you're concerned about, the reporters that you find most sympathetic to you, the reporters that you found honorable in your dealings with them, and so on. And it's very easy to get your news release to those local people, as I said, by email and a follow-up phone call. If you're looking at regional and national coverage, if you have a news release that has national scope, you might want to consider these online services, PR Newswire, PR Web. There are many resources that are available just to do, on a case-by-case basis, news release distribution. They all charge. PR Newswire is probably a little more expensive, but they have a very extensive network, and they're very much respected by the journalist community, which means that they do rely on PR Newswire, and they'll look at what PR Newswire has posted. But there are these other services, including these web services. There is also sort of a new crop of subscription services, and Vocus and Cision are two that are quite expensive, but they give you basically unlimited access to national media by email or fax, and they enable you to customize your distribution lists very specifically. For the most part, I would think that budget-wise, they're probably out of most of our range. The costs range from about $4,800 up to about $10,000 or $12,000, and that's an annual subscription fee. But it might be worth having 3 or 4 organizations in a region that are all working toward a common purpose. If you each kicked in, $1,000 or $2,000 a year, then you'd all have access to that subscription service, and that means that literally at the push of a button, you can get news releases out to any list that you select on any topic in real time, and it's very, very efficient. And they generally have about a 92 to 97% accuracy rate on their email addresses because they're constantly updating them. So that is an option collectively. Not such a good option for a small organization by itself. And there are other online services. It's interesting, if you just Google news release distribution, you'll get lists and lists and lists of online services that can help you get your news releases out. Some of them can help you edit them. Some of them can help you format them if it's an issue for you. And they range from relatively low cost, as I said, to a little more expensive. So there's a lot of electronic support there. Now, I mentioned that along with news releases, media advisories are another option. Media advisories are sort of a quick and dirty announcement to let the media know that something is happening before you really have filled in all the details. So, for example, if you're going to have a news conference and you want to let the media know that this news conference is going to happen, what you do is you just send out a one-page email or fax just saying who is going to hold the event, what the event will be, when it's scheduled, where it will be held, why it's being held, and contacts for more information. So if you've got a news release or a news conference coming up, maybe you want to announce a big new initiative. You say NAIA is going to hold a news conference. It's going to be Tuesday, August 15th. The event is going to be held at this location. This speaker and this speaker and this speaker are going to be present to talk about their roles in the new initiative. And this is basically, we're holding this event to announce this new initiative, which is going to mean this and this and this to the public. It's going to offer this new program. It's going to make these new services available. So you basically just give kind of the skeleton. It's kind of like fleshing out putting the skeleton up there so that media knows something is happening. They get a little taste of what's going on, but they won't really know the full story until they come to your event and actually hear what you have to say about it. So you generally want to send that out maybe a week before or 4 days before your event, and just to let people know that it's coming up. And then you'll want a phone follow-up the day before to say, are you going to be attending our news conference? Just a reminder, it's going to be here at this time on this day, and here's why we're holding it. So it's easier than a news release and shorter. Now, op-ed pieces. That's another great way to get your position out there. You may write an op-ed piece to advocate for a position, to offer suggestions and solutions. For example, if people are considering legislation in a community and you've got a better approach, an op-ed piece is a great way to explain that, a great forum for introducing your ideas. To influence or to inform, to call to action. Richard talked about how important it is to make people feel as though they need to do something with the information that you're giving them. To showcase your expertise. Sometimes it's just about positioning yourself as an expert. We have a guy in the Twin Cities who is a think tank guy. All he does is think. He's a professional thinker. And no matter what the issue is, this guy writes op-ed pieces and gets them printed all the time. And when they explain at the bottom of the column who he is, they say, you know, he's a scholar and think tank member. So he is a professional thinker. And I guess that qualifies him to talk about everything. Because he does. But sometimes that's a great way to showcase your expertise. And to position yourself as a resource for the press. You know, once or twice, you know, if you have your name out there once or twice as somebody who is really knowledgeable about a particular topic, then the next thing you know, reporters, news stations, the TV and radio guys, they're calling you to say, geez, you know, I saw that op-ed piece. I wondered if you'd be willing to talk with us about this or this. So it really does help position yourself as an expert. Now, if you're going to write an op-ed piece, you're going to shoot for a little bit longer length because generally opinion pieces are a little longer and give you an opportunity to go into a little more depth about your issues. So you're going to shoot for 500 to 750 words. You'll need to check with the editor. Sometimes they'll print their requirements online so that you can get a very quick summary of what they expect, but sometimes they don't have that information online, so you might want to check with the editor. You want to make sure that your op-ed piece is timely and relevant. If it's really not an issue that anybody's caring about at the moment, it's really hard to get them to run it because they don't really see any relevance to what's going on. So it's best to kind of wait and see how news developments occur and then try to tie in with the news that's happening at the day so that you can be timely. Use short sentences and paragraphs. People like to read these things, but they like to read them quickly, and they like to digest them quickly. They don't have a lot of time for complicated sentences, run-on sentences. They want it to be simple. Your paragraph 1, you're going to just basically introduce the issue and the key point. Paragraph 2, you're going to explain or expand on the key point. Paragraphs 3 and 4, you're going to, you're going to, hello. How could I do that? Oh, I did a bad thing. Oh, I thought it was going backward. I am going backward. I'm regressing.
There.
Now you're going forward again.
There.
That's at the bottom.
We're on graph 3-4.
Paragraph.
But it's cutting
No,
out
I'm
the
sorry.
bottom line.
Huh?
The bottom line.
We need
is
all-
Yeah, I don't know why that's happening.
You could just tell us what it says.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, basically, it's just this, you know, provide the supporting info and the stats and the documentation, verification, you know, any expert testimony that you have that people, you know, people with credibility are supporting your point of view. You can bring that information forward. And then your final paragraph is just going to be the summary and the call to action. And don't forget that call to action because that's important. What do you want people to do with the information? I mean, it might be something as simple as, you know, the next time you listen to PETA, don't believe him. Or it might be, when you go to the polls to vote on this issue, vote yes or vote no. Or it might be, call your city councilor and tell them you think this is a really dumb idea. But it's a call to action generally, and that's what you want to accomplish. You want to use that op-ed piece to try to motivate action.
Question?
Yes?
When you're writing an op-ed piece, I didn't see any mention in there of establishing your own credibility. Do you do that at all, or is
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
how?
Just explain, you might explain it either in the piece itself, or you can give them a little paragraph that they'll put at the end of the piece, saying, so-and-so is a professional pet breeder who has operated such and such a business for the last 25 years. And you can either refer to that in the body of the piece, or you can basically provide it as an editor's note, and they'll add it at the end of the piece.
To get their attention, could you say the scandal of PETA, and would that create curiosity in their mind? What are you talking about?
Well, I think in an op-ed piece, you want to make your position very clear in the headline. And generally speaking, I like to think of the headline as being the opportunity to get your position out there. In other words, and I don't believe in giving the other guy visibility. So I would never use a headline like, PETA's whacked out. But what I would say is, local group attacks animal rights extremism. Okay? Or NAIA attacks animal rights extremism. Because what you want to do is you want people to keep reading to get more of the story, and you don't want to turn them off in the first 10 words. There are a lot of people out there, and you and I know this, there are a lot of people out there that give to the PETAs of the world with no clue what those groups are really about. They think it's about spaying and neutering pets. They don't understand it. They think it's about pet shelters. How many people give to the Humane Society of the United States because they think it's their local Humane Society? Yeah, so these people don't know it. So you don't want to alienate them right away by sort of suggesting, if you're giving to these groups, you're a dumbbell. But what you want to do is say a lot of well-intentioned people support these groups without knowing what they're really about. And that's more for message development, so we'll talk about that later. But yeah.
We have a local anchorman who's very popular in this area who keeps supporting the Humane Society of the United States, and I don't think he really understands what he's telling people to give money to. How do we approach this guy and explain to him that this is not the right direction? We should be donating to the local Humane Societies, not the Humane Society of the United States.
What I would do is I would ask for an opportunity to sit down with him.
Invite him to lunch?
Yeah. If you invite him to lunch, this is kind of getting off the subject, but it's an important. But this is important. In the post-Watergate era, the relationship between media and sources changed a lot, and media now try, at least theoretically, to adhere to a very high ethical standard. Now, don't laugh. But what that means is they won't let you buy them lunch. They won't let you wine and dine them. If you invite them to lunch, you need to make it very clear that I understand that it wouldn't be appropriate for me to buy you lunch, but I would very much like to sit down with you over a light lunch and talk about the issues that we deal with and that you're covering, and maybe give you some background information that would be helpful to you as you cover these issues. So be sensitive to the ethical complications there.
Would you offer to pick up the tab?
No, you don't have to pick up the tab. You never offer to pick up the tab.
You want to be Dutch?
Yeah. Yes.
That was a good question.
How dangerous, when you're writing one of these things, is humor?
Well, the first creative director that I ever worked with back a long time ago said, if you can't do it great, play it straight. And usually, if the topic is serious, it's better not to try to use humor unless you can do it very, very well and not run the risk of alienating or offending anybody. And that can be pretty tricky. Irony, sure. You can put a little spin on things sometimes that is a little ironic, but my preference is not to try to be funny, because usually if we're trying, we don't do it very well.
We're both with the Pennsylvania Federation of Dog Clubs, and we've been fighting regulations recently. And our president in one of these made the observation that the regulations refer to a dog being able to, in the enclosure, lie in a recumbent position. And she made the point that the only dog she's ever seen lying in a recumbent position was dead. And that, next thing we know, we were getting all kinds of hate mail.
Yeah. Well, and I'll give you another great example of that. One of my friends in the fur trade was the president of one of our associations, and he had a local reporter come to visit him about some issues, the animal rights stuff primarily. And this reporter was a very attractive woman, and this guy was a very good-looking guy, and he was recently single, and so there was very good chemistry, and he was very encouraged by the good chemistry, and he said, oh, I think this lady really likes me and we're gonna have a very good story. So she asked him a question about, do you think that the animal rights movement is gonna basically kill the fur trade? And he said, you know, the fur trade is the world's second oldest profession. I don't think it's gonna go out of business. That was the lead line of the story. And she laughed, and he thought that was really funny. It was kind of like, yeah, I know what you mean. You know, the caveman was wearing fur skins to keep warm in the cave, you know, so we get it, but it was just really kind of a dumb thing to say, and sometimes that winds up then becoming the story. And when you look at the number of politicians that have really stuck their foot in their mouths, trying to be funny and not being very funny, it shows you the danger of using humor if you don't do it well. So I think in op-ed pieces, it's very important that every word be used appropriately to get your message out in the way that you need people to understand it. And usually, I would say, stay away from trying to be funny.
I accidentally got an op-ed piece in.
How did that happen?
Well, I think it's a different route to get one in. There was an article on somebody, pet store type person breeding a lot of dogs in their house, and somebody buying a dog that was sick and spending a lot of money on it. And it was online, and it said comments. And so basically, without realizing it, I wrote a piece and said, you know, I'm a dog show judge, I've been in dogs for 50 years, and if you want to buy a good dog, this is what you should do, and I did bullet points. And I got a call, and they said, would it be okay if we use this for an op-ed piece?
Wow.
And I was like, wow. So I think sometimes in the comments for stories online, you can actually write an op-ed piece and they might pick it up, because they did.
That's absolutely right. And I think and when we talk about internet, that's one of the things that I think becomes really important, is that when you're looking at these news websites, almost all of them now have an opportunity to respond and to comment to coverage. And it really gives you a much better opportunity than we've ever had in the past to be able to get your message out there. And that's a great story, and I would not underestimate the value of that. Let me just finish up this little piece about submitting an op-ed, and then I think we're taking a break. Patty, is that our schedule? Okay. You're going to want to email and fax to the editor, just to make double sure that they can't say they didn't get it. You're going to want to call to verify the receipt of the piece and to ask consideration. We'd really appreciate it if you'd run this, consider running this op-ed piece, because it's very topical. It's a perspective that people need to hear. You should also address the exclusivity issue. If you send the same op-ed piece to 10 papers at the same time, and 3 of them run the same piece, one of them is going to be upset because the other 2 ran the same piece. So what you want to do is you want to say, I'm submitting this piece to you first. I haven't submitted it to anyone else. If you're not going to use it, I really would appreciate if you would let me know in the next few days, because if you don't want it, then I'll see if I can't get someone else to run it. So let them know that they're not going to see this popping up anyplace else if they decide to run it. And then after they've run it, then you can adjust the piece, make some slight changes so that it's not identical, and then you can circulate it to other publications. For example, you might have a weekly newspaper in your community that's kind of a backup newspaper to the daily newspaper in your community. So you might run it in the daily newspaper and then adjust it a little bit and send it around to that weekly and maybe a few other weeklies in the area. So you can get mileage out of that piece, but it's not the identical piece. But newspapers get very upset about exclusivity. Yeah.
What about newspapers in different regions? If you sit, like, we live in a small town near Roanoke, Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we put something in the Roanoke paper, is there a problem with sending the same thing to the local paper, which is weekly?
No, again, it's, if you run it in the daily paper, then if you're going to send it to other places, you should adjust it, make some changes in it so it's not identical. It can have the same basic content, but maybe change the lead paragraph, just adjust it a little bit so it's not identical, because papers really don't like running the same stuff that everybody else runs. So once it's run, then you need to change it before you can run it anyplace else. The other issue of exclusivity, let me just tell you one quick story. When I was the press secretary to the Lieutenant Governor in Minnesota back a few years ago, and I had come out of one newspaper market. I lived up in northern Minnesota, Duluth, Minnesota, right on Lake Superior. We only had one major paper, so I never really had to deal with competition between newspapers. There was really only one. So when I came to the Twin Cities, I was working at the Capitol, and the Capitol Press Corps was right downstairs in the Capitol building, which meant that those reporters were there all the time. And when you wanted to pitch a story, you just walked downstairs. So I went down and I was delivering a news release, and it was pretty hot news. And one of the guys from one of the major papers wasn't in his office. And I thought, well, I'll go back in 5 minutes and see if he's back there. And I forgot. And so everybody else had the news, but the Minneapolis Star-Tribune did not have the news. And that guy just beat the hell out of me. And he came up and he said, "What is the matter with you? You know, you gave me this 2 hours after everybody else got it, you know, and it was already all over the TV and it was already all over the radio. You know, what is your problem?" And I said, "I really screwed up. I'm really sorry." I said, I'm used to working in a one newspaper town. It didn't even occur to me about access and exclusivity and the competitive issues. But I said, "I really appreciate your explaining to me how important that is, and I swear to God I'll never make that mistake again." And I never did. So just keep in mind that there are those competitive issues, and you have to be even-handed. Unless there's a situation where you've had one newspaper that's maybe very unfair to you, they don't do a good job of covering your issue, and there's another newspaper that's a little better, it's okay to work more with them. But, you know, try not to be very discriminatory in your handling of the press, because it can come back and it can bite you. And then, as I said, you know, you follow up on the status of it. If the editor says to you after the thing has been sitting a week, and the editor says to you, "You know, it's unlikely we're going to run it," then say, "Well, I appreciate that, thanks. I'm going to send it on now to somebody else," and let them know that it's going to run someplace else, so that there's no kind of hanging, not resolved sense to that issue. All right, I think we can take a break, and then we can come back. We'll talk a little bit about letters to the editor and other good stuff.
Thank you all, and we'd like to go ahead and turn the floor over to Marsha again, who's giving us all kinds of wonderful information. Thank you.
Thanks, Patty. Again, I hope this isn't too elementary for everybody. You know, Patty had suggested that a lot of people kind of like to know some of this basic stuff, and so I'm going through it, but I do apologize if you're kind of beyond me in some of this. Let's talk quickly about letters to the editor. You know, you write letters to the editor, why? To respond to news coverage, to respond to editorial coverage. Sometimes you use the op-ed pieces to respond to editorial coverage, but that's sometimes, those opportunities are few and far between. So more typically, you'll use a letter to the editor to respond to news or editorial coverage. To respond to another letter, to advocate a position, which may not be in response to anything except current events, or to call to action, again, perhaps in response to current events as opposed to any particular coverage or article or editorial. Writing letters to the editor, number one issue is timeliness. Respond within 48 hours. If you don't respond within 48 hours, the people who might have been impacted by the original story or editorial are going to basically forget about it, and there's no point in reintroducing the issue after that. So try to respond within 48 hours. Observe length limits. Virtually every newspaper has on its website the requirements for letters to the editor. Some will give you 200 words, some will give you 300 words, a few will even give you 250 or 350 words. So make sure that you look at and observe those length limits. Make sure that if you're going to use quotes or statistics, that you source them, that you identify where you got them. Most of the time, editors, if you don't do that, will call you and say, "Do you have verification for this statistic? Where did you get this statistic?" So it's better to give that information up front than to make them go through the extra step of calling you. Sometimes that'll be the difference between getting your letter printed or not. If the letter contains information that the newspaper doesn't feel confident is accurate or can't verify, they won't use it. Focus on your message. This is so important, and we're going to talk later about focusing on message. But the worst thing you can do in a letter to the editor is repeat the stuff that was said in whatever it is you're responding to. If you've only got 200 words, why should you waste 100 of them restating what bad people say about you? That makes no sense. You don't ever want to respond directly. Some people say, well, I want to go through point by point. Wrong. Then you're articulating their messages, not your message. So you want to focus on your message. And there's a way that you can address the issues that were addressed in the original piece without specifically citing the negatives. So don't get put in a position of making the other guy's case. Focus on your messages. Now, in greyhound racing, for example, we might see a newspaper story about adoption, greyhound adoption, which is a very successful effort. The story might say, according to the Humane Society of the United States, 20,000 greyhounds are put to sleep every year, which is ridiculous. There are barely that many greyhounds bred every year. So when we write a letter to the editor, we don't say, your writer said that 20,000 greyhounds are euthanized each year. We don't say that. We say your readers might like to know that more than 90% of all registered greyhounds are adopted or returned to the farm as pets or breeders when they retire. So our message gets out and not the other guy's message. You don't want to introduce those arguments to people who may not have seen the original story. Why should you educate people who might not have seen the original story about what the bad guys say about you? Okay?
You
So,
contradicted the other guy's message without.
right. You can address the issues. A lot of these animal rights letters about greyhound racing have to do with 4D meat. And I'm sure you guys are very familiar with that issue too. And so they'll say, oh, they feed them this diseased, nasty meat, And when we write a response to that, we say, greyhounds have to be fed a very nutritious diet in order to perform at their best. And so the meat that they are fed is not appropriate for human consumption, but perfectly fine for animals and pets. So focus on your message, not the bad guy's messages. Avoid personal attacks. Your letter will not be written if you personally vilify a local animal rights person or a local activist or kind of engage in a personal attack. You can certainly say this organization, often misstates the facts, but do not resort to personal attacks because newspapers get very nervous about that and they won't run it. Maintain a reasonable tone. We always want to position ourselves as the reasonable ones. It's the other people who are crazy, not us. Okay? They're the ones that are whacked out, not us. So our tone has to be reasonable, moderate. Remember that in the great world of the unwashed, there are 10% on this end who are animal rights crazies. There are 10% on this end who are animal abusers, the Michael Vicks of the world. And everybody in the middle is where that's where we want to be. Everybody in the middle is our constituency. Those people that just want to know that you are doing a good job and being responsible. So we have to maintain that reasonable tone and let people be comfortable with who we are. People are comfortable with moderate, reasonable, responsible. That's what they respond to, so that's who we are. And write clearly and concisely. 200 words doesn't give you a lot of time for, excess language. Excuse me. So keep your language clear and concise. Your message is very focused. Most newspaper websites do have mechanisms to submit the letter to the editor right online. And if you can use that mechanism, that will work very well. Your letter will get to its desired destination. If they don't have a mechanism for sending the letters, they generally will at least have a link to an email, a web-based email, and then you can send the letter in your email. But if you can't figure out a way to get the letter to the editor, then just call the newspaper and ask for the editor's email and send the letter directly by email to that editor. And always keep a copy of the letter that you sent and the date that it was sent so that you can go back and monitor and look for coverage. And usually it's going to take anywhere from a week to 10 days for a letter to appear in the paper. They don't run them in a timely way. And that's one of the other reasons why it's so important for you to get the response in right away, because it's probably going to sit for anywhere from 4 to 10 days before it appears. They really don't pay much attention to when they put these things in. So the earlier you get it in, the better shot you have of getting it published while somebody's, cares. Is there a question? Oh, okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit about editorial briefings. Editorial briefings are for the specific purpose of having a one-to-one meeting with an editorial board or a single editor or an editor and key reporters to introduce yourself as a local resource and expert on the issues that you are involved with. So you might want to introduce yourself, you might want to offer your perspective on issues that are timely. And you might also want to talk to the editor about addressing concerns about coverage, how their newspaper is covering your issue. In other words, sometimes you're just there to educate and position yourself as an expert, and sometimes you're there to gripe. And it's important to be clear about what your purpose is when you go in there. You could email or call the editor's office. Generally, all you have to ask for is about 20 minutes of their time. You're not going to get more than that usually unless they're really interested in your issue, and then that's okay, that's great. They might drive the meeting longer, but usually 20 minutes is about the max you can expect. Be specific about the purpose of the meeting. It's not really very helpful to an editor just to say, well, we just wanted to come in and say hello. Let the editor know, there's been a change in our organization. We'd like you to meet our new president and executive staff because they have an agenda that is really important and your readers might want to know about. Or we want to talk to you about the way coverage has been going because we've got some concerns about how our issue is being covered. So you need to be very clear with them about the purpose of the meeting. Explain how the briefing will benefit the newspaper's coverage of your issue. In other words, it's not just about you. You have to put yourself in the editor's position. What does the editor want? The editor wants to cover issues in a fair and balanced way. So your goal is to help them cover the issues in a fair and balanced way. I almost hate saying fair and balanced because that seems like the ownership of one particular network, and it's not. But so explain. We want to give you the information you need to cover this issue from a variety of perspectives. We want to give you the information that you need to help you cover this issue with more depth, and so on. And keep in mind that the deadlines will drive scheduling. So you might say to the editor, I'd like to come in, I'm going to be in your area at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. And he might say, well, I'm glad for you, but 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon is when I'm putting the paper to bed, so there's no way I'm going to be available at 3 o'clock. But if you want to come in at 9 o'clock in the morning, that I can do. So understand that the editor's availability is going to be driven by his or her schedule in terms of the newspaper's operation. Remember the 3 R's of editorial briefings. Realistic expectations, number 1. If you go into an editorial briefing thinking that you're going to get an editorial supporting your point of view, that's probably not going to happen, very rarely. Other than candidates who look for endorsements and may or may not get endorsements, very rarely does an editorial briefing immediately or even over the long term result in editorial coverage that supports your point of view. So that's probably not realistic. If you go in looking for about-face change in the way the editor assigns coverage of your issue, that's probably not going to happen either. 99% of the time, an editor is going to back up their reporters, and the most they're going to do is ask their reporters to be a little bit more sensitive to your perspective, which is a plus. But be realistic about what you can expect. Maintain a reasonable tone. I think it was Will Rogers who said it doesn't pay to get in a fight with people who buy ink in trucks. They always have more ink than you. They always have the last word. So don't ever think that you're going to beat them down, because that does not happen. Go in with a reasonable tone and say, look, we understand that you have a job to do. We understand that you're not in the business of making us look good. We don't expect you to do that. But there is an issue of balance here, and we just want to see a little more balanced approach. And be responsive. If they say, well, one of the problems that we're having is that your people don't call us back in a timely way, so we can't get the statements that you want us to know. We can't get those statements before we go to press. That's important for you to know. The media business is all about deadlines. And if you're not respecting the deadlines of the reporters that you are dealing with, you can't expect your story to get out there. You have to be available in order to get your story out. So you have to respond to the feedback that they give you. If they say, well, you're giving us information that's really not verified. Well, what can we do to help you verify it? Here are some sources that you can go to that'll give you the same statistical information. Here are some experts that will back up our point of view. So make sure that you respond to the feedback that you get from them. And again, the positive approach is always the best approach. If you're having a conflict about coverage, you say, okay, here's the bottom line. I mean, we're upset about this and this and this, and be sure you document those instances of what you think to be unfair coverage or biased coverage. Here are the examples of where we've seen a problem. How can we help you do a better job? What can we do to make it easier for you to bring balance to your coverage of this story? That's the way to approach the newspaper, because it isn't about you as far as they're concerned. It's about their job to be responsible and moderate and balanced in their presentations. So when you go to the briefing, you're going to want to bring them a couple of pages in print, a couple of basic things about who you are, your name, your position, your contact information, a basic description of your organization, who you are, what you do, your position statements on key issues, and a list of experts who share your perspective, including contact information for them. Now, this is something that you need to, of course, clear in advance with those experts. So if I'm Patty Strand and I say, okay, I've got a reporter that wants to do, I'm in an editorial briefing and I want to educate these reporters about our issues, I'm going to speak from the perspective of a pet breeder because that's what I do, but I also have this bigger picture. I'm going to tell you about that, but if you want to talk to somebody in biomedical research, here's Larry Katz's number. She knows that Larry Katz gets the issue and that he's going to be able to speak in the correct way. So before you give those experts' names and numbers to the press, make damn sure that they're on your page and that you know who they are and what they're going to say and that they've agreed to be a source for you on these issues. So that's editorial board meetings, and you need to kind of pick those carefully because editors are busy and they really don't like your taking up their time unless you have something significant to say. So use those judiciously. Those are not things that you want to do once a month. That's something that you maybe do once a year. You might do it, for example, at the beginning of a legislative session where you say, we're introducing major legislation this year. Senator XYZ has agreed to carry it for us. Here's the agenda that we're going to be working on during the session. And then they'll have an opportunity to look at that and refer back to that. And in their coverage, they'll say, this was one of the big 3 items on that agenda for the year. So make sure that when you ask for those editorial briefings, that there's a good reason to do that and you're not just wasting people's time. Now we'll talk a little bit about reporter meetings. And as I said, at the local level, these are really easy. I mean, you can stop by you can call a reporter and say, look, can I stop by for 10 minutes just to introduce myself and give you some background information. Contact the reporter covering your issues, request a short meeting to introduce yourself and your organization, give them some printed materials for future reference. You can also give them your website location, tell them to feel free to look at your website and contact you through the website if that's necessary. And just clarify that your goal is just to help them write balanced and accurate stories. You're not looking, you recognize that they're going to cover the other side too, and you understand that. You just want to make sure that they've got balanced, accurate information from you. Okay, so that's print. And any further discussion of sort of outreach to print media before we move on? Yes, ma'am.
You may be going to get into this later. What is the best way to approach people initially who have no idea that there is another side without us sounding like conspiracy theorists or something? I mean, when you walk into somebody who thinks AKSUS is the Humane Society,
Well, I think
it's very difficult to start that conversation without sounding like somebody with an aluminum foil.
Yeah. No, I hear what you're saying. I think one of the most important things is to let other very credible sources deliver that message for you. For example, when the AMA comes out and talks about Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, PCRM, that has juice. I might say to a reporter, PCRM is nothing but a bunch of wackos parading as doctors when only 10% of them are even physicians. And they might say, yeah, whatever, you've obviously got an issue. But if the AMA says PCRM is a bunch of wackos, they take that seriously. So look for other sources of information that can basically give them that same perspective. And then say, look, I understand that you might not consider me to be the most credible source because I, obviously have a perspective. But here are people who don't have my perspective. They're not in my business. They're not pet breeders. They're not medical researchers. They're not fur farmers. And here's what they say about HSUS. And increasingly, thanks to the work that Patty does and other organizations, increasingly there's press coverage out there, there's editorial coverage out there that's very condemning of groups like HSUS and PETA and their increasing extremism. Particularly HSUS, which since Wayne Pacelli took charge has just gone off the charts, and it's really great for us. It's a blessing for us that they hired Wayne Pacelli. Because now they are a target. It used to be that PETA was our favorite target. Now PETA and HSUS have equal stature because they're both run by crazy people. So it really does give us an advantage. It really does give us an advantage.
Do reporters have, you want to be respectful to the reporter, they have their job, they have their personal life, they have their off time, but if you know, a reporter is in like one of my dog training classes, he's there working his dog, training his dog, we can still, strike up a conversation and maybe talk about some of our issues. Is there a level of respect there that, you shouldn't be bugging them?
Yeah, I think oftentimes people don't like to be working in their off time. And I think if I were in that situation, I would just say, sometime, during your workday, when you have a few minutes, I'd like to come in and chat with you. We've never really talked about this issue because we have this whole other thing in common, but we've never really talked about this issue. I'd really love to talk to you about this issue, but I don't want to take up your free time to do that. So let's schedule a time when we can sit down and visit.
So make an appointment.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Yeah, I think you have to respect people's downtime. Yeah. Okay, we're going to talk quickly about TV. We're still scheduled to break at 11:30 for lunch, or? Okay. We're going to talk quickly about TV, and then we're going to kind of shift gears in the afternoon session. As far as television, you might have a news conference that you want to host to talk about big news, other media events where you've maybe got an adoption reunion or a clinic for spaying and neutering, those kinds of things. You want to get media coverage to your events, and you also might have to respond to other people's events. There might be a protest outside your clinic because you're doing something that they don't like, and so you might have to respond in the context of protest. Or then you might be just making studio appearances, sometimes doing debates or doing discussions, public affairs kinds of panels on TV in a studio setting. News conferences are only for big news. It's really hard to get media out to a news conference, especially in larger markets. In smaller markets, it's not quite as hard, but I'll tell you what, in the Twin Cities, it is like pulling teeth to get media to come to a news conference. And so you really have to reserve those for big news. We have a $50,000 grant and we're going to do this program with it and it's going to benefit all these pet owners, or we've got this new research project and here's how we're going to benefit humanity by doing this research. So make sure that it's only for big news. Pick a location that's convenient to media. Often we want to showcase our own locations, and sometimes that can work. But if your location is, an hour and a half drive for the nearest TV station, you are not going to get TV coverage of that issue unless there's something very, very important about that location. For example, if I'm talking about pollution on an industrial site, that might be reason to have news reporters come out to a site 75 miles away so that I can show them toxic barrels sitting there in a pond. But other than that, it's pretty hard to get people to go to that length to show up at your event. So when possible, pick a location that's convenient to the media, especially the TV stations. They have a lot of equipment to schlep. When you're going to have a news conference, you don't want them to have a 4-block walk from where they park with all their cameras and their heavy battery packs and all that stuff. That is not going to make you a popular person. So convenience is key, especially for the TV media. TV is all about visuals. So it's not only talking heads in a news conference, but it might be exhibits or graphics. Every year, or twice a year in Minnesota, when the governor is going to present his budget forecast, he stands at the podium like this and there's a big honking graph showing Minnesota basically going down the toilet. and then of course, he shows all the things that he's going to do to pull us out of the toilet, and that's further graphs. But they're all nice and big so that the TV cameras can get a good look at them. And then what they do, and this is a very good idea, this is how people get elected governor because they're not dumb, they hand out either discs or little jump drives with all the graphics available, so that if you're a newspaper reporter, you can just hand that off to the editor, and they'll plug in those graphics, and on TV, they'll just wire those graphics into their electronics, and they'll show them on the screen. So the visuals and the exhibits or graphics are sometimes really helpful. I was talking to one of these gentlemen earlier that was talking about bringing his doggies to an event. Dogs are great visuals. You know, if you're going to have an event, there's nothing better than bringing your pet, you know, to the event. And that's automatic, that's a gimme. You know, that's just a gimme because that's just great visuals. So it's all about visuals on television. And as I said, occasionally a backdrop might be important. If you're, for example, introducing a new clinic, like Cindy was talking about having a new clinic operation, and if you want to, if you want the media to be able to show the facility and show how the various aspects of the facility are going to be used to benefit the public and to benefit animals, that's great. But make sure that that backdrop is accessible, or you make it accessible. Notify the media 3 or 4 days in advance, if possible, on a news conference. Usually you announce those in the form of a media advisory, that little shorter skeleton version of a news release, the who, what, when, where, why, we're going to have something big to say. Schedule before noon if possible, because that gives you the maximum coverage and also accommodates all the deadlines. I mean, in most cases, TV reporters are going to have to be back to the station by at least 3 o'clock in the afternoon to do their editing in time for the news at 5 o'clock. So if they're not out of there and well back in a position to begin editing by 3 o'clock, you're not going to get coverage that night. So try to get your stuff done before noon. Reserve a room large enough. This is a real problem because you don't really realize how much space TV cameras take up. So if you're going to have a news conference, make sure that not only do you have a podium where speakers can speak and radio reporters can hook up their microphones. You know, you look at any big news event and there's 50 microphones on the podium. Well, that's because there are a lot of radio people that want to get good, clear audio. So make sure that you have a podium. Make sure that you have room for the speakers who might be speaking in the news conference. Any exhibits that you're going to stand on easels or however you're going to post them. Make sure that you have room for the TV cameras. I mean, normally what you're going to do is you're going to leave space in front for the TV cameras because they have to have unobstructed access. They're not going to shoot from the back of the room because they're going to be shooting over people's heads. So they need to be positioned in the front of the room, and then you have to make chairs available for the sit-down reporters, the print reporters, and the audience. And sometimes you want to have an audience at a news conference to yell and scream and clap and act generally supportive. You want to make sure that you're in a room that has enough electricity to power things. A lot of times these reporters, if their battery packs are going down and they don't have time to change batteries, they're going to need to plug in to an outlet in order to make sure that they have enough power to shoot you. So, not shoot you, but so make sure that you have an adequate supply of electricity and you're not going to blow somebody's fuse. As I said, you want a podium to hold the radio mics. You want to have a news release at the event that you can put in the reporter's hands, because if they're pressed for time, it's going to be really helpful if they can go back to the station and they can say, here's who was there, here's what their title was, here's what they announced, and all that is contained right there on paper. And it's positioned in the way you want to position it. Now, they might not use all of that, but at least they're going to get the names and the titles right, and they're going to get the key message right, because you've given them a news release that says what you want it to say. And then have the graphics available on disk or on travel drive so that you can make sure that they have access to the graphics if they want them. When you're doing media events, that is non-news conferences, but other events where you want to draw media, just make sure that you're in a convenient location, that media know where to go. You want to have somebody positioned at the point where media are going to enter the property so that media can say, go right down this hall to your right. So they're not wandering around saying, am I supposed to be? Where am I supposed to be? Where are the people going to talk? Make sure that you assign somebody to that. Have the program and the material well organized. Don't waste reporters' time. They really don't like that when you waste their time. When you're responding to others' events, and this might be, for example, as I said, at a protest. A lot of times, we're dealing with a protest and the media want to get both sides, so they want to come and they want to talk to you. Make sure that you put your distance between yourself and the negative visuals. You don't want to be standing in front of a protest when people are standing right behind you with, placards saying, rodeos kill, or, pet breeders suck or any of that stuff. So, get yourself out of that environment and tell the reporters, let's go over here where it's quiet and I can speak to you without distraction, and take them into an office or take them into another location where there is no visual distraction to confuse you and get in the way of your message. Remember that reasonable tone, you don't want to be defensive, you don't want to be angry, you just want to be matter of fact, These organizations have another agenda. It's really not about animal welfare. It's about a radical agenda. We've known that for a long time. This is one of their standard strategies. It's a free country. Everybody can protest. They're just off the mark. They just don't get it. Provide factual information in written form so that they have something to go home with. A lot of times what will happen, especially if there's a lot of news going on, a TV station will send a cameraman, but not a reporter. And when that happens, that cameraman is totally clueless. But he's going to go back to the station, he's going to deliver his video to a reporter, and a reporter who didn't cover your event is going to write the story. So that's why it's really important, if the cameraman shows up without a reporter, that you give the cameraman that news release or that factual information so he can go back and give that to the reporter that's going to actually do the writing and editing of the story. Occasionally you might be asked to do studio appearances. These are usually taped, but once in a while they're live. I'd say probably 80% of the time they're taped. And sometimes if you make a really bad mistake, or if you have a problem, sometimes they'll go back and do it all over. Not very often, but sometimes they'll give you a second chance. I've had that happen once or twice, but not very often. But normally these studio appearances, a lot of times they'll include all sides of the issue. They'll have a panel discussion. Most markets that have local TV stations have some kind of a little public affairs program where they talk about current issues. So they might bring in, let's say that you're talking about an ordinance that might be passed. They might bring in a city councilor who's carrying the ordinance, somebody from your organization who's opposing the ordinance, a veterinarian who can speak to the veterinary science behind it, and maybe some other politician that thinks it's a bad idea. So it'll be a panel. They'll try to include all sides. It's usually very topical. And it's usually moderated by someone who really isn't involved. And the job of that moderator is generally make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to be heard. So those are not situations to be feared. They're actually situations to be welcomed. You want to dress conservatively in cases like that. If you've ever watched television where somebody was wearing really bright stripes or plaids, it'll give you a headache. It makes you dizzy to look at it because of the effect, especially with high definition. I mean, it can really hurt your eyeballs. So you want to do solid colors. Avoid black if possible, because black just absorbs so much light. Avoid the blacks, but go with solid colors. Blue or red are very good TV colors, so just keep that in mind. For men, a blue or a white shirt inside a blue suit works very well. Sometimes very bright whites. You don't want to wear too much white, because white creates glare, and then they have to do a lot of adjusting of the cameras. They do what they call a white balance, which if you've ever done a TV interview, they'll hold up a white sheet of paper in front of the camera, and then they try to adjust the camera so it's not glaring off the paper, and that's what they do if you're wearing white clothing. So it's better sometimes not to wear a lot of white, but just a little bit of white shirt inside a suit jacket, that's fine. Modest makeup, ladies, no blue eyeshadow. No blue eyeshadow. And for the men, I would really advise against the blue eyeshadow. If you need a little bit of perking up, generally they have somebody at the studio who can do that. They'll put a little blush on you. If your little bald head is shining, they'll pat you down with a little bit of powder, so you don't have to worry about that. So err on the side of, more modest makeup and let them fix it. And dress to be comfortable. You don't want anything to be distracting you from focusing on your message. I had the great misfortune one time of wearing to a media interview pants that were just a little too tight. And I bet nobody else has had that experience in this room. And of course, because they were too tight, I couldn't button the top button. So I pinned it. You know what happened. I don't have to lay it out. You know what happened. So I was, I went through 2/3 of the interview with a pin sticking right in my stomach and, not wanting to let on that was not feeling good. So you don't want to take chances on having your clothing distract you from your message. Sit up straight when you're seated in a TV interview situation. You want to sit slightly forward because you want to communicate a feeling of active engagement and interest. You don't want to be sitting back. You don't want to have your arms folded in a defensive posture. read one of those books about body language and you'll know everything you need to know about how to position yourself physically, because it's all about appearing to be engaged and open. Look directly at the interviewer or the speaker. It's really hard when you first go on television to know where to look, and you always kind of look at that camera. It's like watching a snake swallow a mongoose. You can't take your eyes off it. You just watch it. It's this big eye. But you don't want to do that because it's not natural. What you want to do is interact with the people that are asking you questions and talking with you. And let the cameramen worry about how they're going to position themselves so that they catch the right angles in the face and the exchange. If you just focus on the people, you'll be fine. The only time that there's an exception to that is sometimes at the beginning of a panel show, they'll say, we have with us Dr. Larry Katz from Rutgers, and they'll shoot a shot of Larry, and then they'll shoot right at Larry, and Larry will look into the camera and smile. And it's okay to do that. But they'll tell you, look right into the camera when we say your name. That'll probably be the only time. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry. All I saw was an arm. I couldn't see a head.
Okay. I was wondering how you deal with interruptions after the panel is underway or the appearance of the discussion.
That's a good question. I think if other people are interrupting you a lot, you need to call attention to it. And you can do that in a gracious way. You can say, I'd like to be able to finish my thought. And I appreciate that you have something to say. Let me just finish my thought. I had that experience one time when I was doing an interview situation on a public affairs program, and one of the announcers just kind of broke in, and I said, Pat, just let me finish my thought. And he backed off right away. And so usually you can do that.
But in the case of an opposing view,
same thing. Yeah, same thing. Just say, I appreciate that you have something to say, and I know you're going to disagree with me, but let me finish my thought first.
Yeah.
Then it's all yours.
It's reminiscent of the CNN arguments late at night.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and most of the time, a moderator is not going to allow that to happen a lot. If there's a moderator on the program, the moderator is going to say, let him finish, or let her finish, and you'll have your turn in a minute. But if they don't do that, then you need to do that. Okay, so we're going to sit up straight, we're going to look at the interviewer, we're going to gesture naturally, but don't put your hands in front of your face. Think of your body, your torso, as a box between your shoulders and your waist. That's your gesture box. That's the space in which you can gesture. And you don't want to be outside of that box. You don't want to put your hand in front of your face, okay? So just think about this torso as being your gesture box, and you can gesture inside that box. But if you go too much outside of that frame, the camera is going to lose you, and you're going to look like you don't have any hands, or, like you have very short arms. So just keep it within the torso box. And, smile when it's appropriate, but don't force it. There's nothing worse than seeing somebody, forcing a smile when they're talking about really bad stuff. And you kind of think either you're brain dead and you're not understanding the issue, or somebody told you to smile but forgot to tell you when appropriate. So relax, smile, be friendly, be open, but don't force it. Yep, okay.
Marsha, can I
Yeah.
quick question? Often on these panels, when your opposition is making a point that is ludicrous, the camera might be on you to capture your reaction. So I think if you wanted to comment a little bit on you.
Good point. Do you remember how, I don't even remember the exact political context, but in one of the presidential debates, I think it might have been the Gore-Bush debates, Gore took as much flack for his reactions to Bush's comments as for anything that he said, because he was very, rolling the eyes, and you just can't do that. That really alienates people. You have to treat your opposition with respect, and you have to respect the fact that there are some people in the audience that are buying into that point of view. And when you make fun of that person, you make fun of all those people who don't know any better and are plugged into what that person is saying. So you have to be very even. You can make a note. You can respond in terms of preparing your own argument, but you don't want to be visibly reacting to what the other guy is saying.
I've noticed quite a bit people are on TV, especially political candidates, and they are communicating a positive message, but they're moving their head like this.
Yeah,
And it's like,
right. Well, it's all about body language.
Yeah.
You know, and on TV, it's all about visuals, and when people can see you and they see that your face and your body language are telling them something very different from what your words are saying,
I'm
that,
saying yes, and you're
that-
saying no.
that's right, that lack of congruence between the message and the appearance can be very devastating. I remember one time, and then we'll just stop until we come back. One time when I was working with the fur trade, one of the gals that worked with me had been doing an interview with a newspaper in Salt Lake City. And the reporter said that the reporter had asked a question about how mink were euthanized. And before this conversation, the conversation had been very cordial, and Wendy was very good at delivering all the messages. But the reporter wrote, when I asked the question about euthanasia, her face changed. And the whole next paragraph was all about how she looked as though she was really uncomfortable with that question. And they finally got around to saying, well, she eventually said, we euthanize mink using bottled gas, which is, according to veterinary recommendation, carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide bottled gas. And if she had just said it off the bat, we use the same method that many shelters use, we use gas, it would have been a lot easier, and she wouldn't have provoked that reaction, but it freaked her out because she didn't really want to say it. So, in that case, even in print, and this was not a TV interview, but even in print, people learned about her visual expression, and it colored the way they perceived her answer. So that's really, really important.
That's gonna be almost impossible not to react to something that bothers you.
Well, it is, but you have to discipline yourself. And it doesn't mean you're going to be completely impassive. I mean, everybody is going to react a little bit. People are going to be able to see by your face, in many respects, that you have a problem with what's being said. But you don't want to visibly make fun of or mock or demean the other person's statements. That's what you don't want.
What happens if you do something completely different? What happens if your feeling, which is my feeling in some ways, I mean, I'm angry too, but I feel really badly in some ways for some of the people who've gotten themselves stuck in this. I don't agree with them, but I feel tremendous sadness that they have gotten so involved in something which is so contrary to what I really think, who I really think these people are. What happens if you're being interviewed and you share those, you allow yourself to express some manner of concern or sadness that the person is sharing this feeling or these views? Is that problematic?
It depends on how you handle it. I mean, I think that might be considered patronizing, and it might have a negative impact in terms of your audience. It just depends on how it's done. I mean, I think in a respectful way, you can say, it's very disappointing when I hear people express that point of view, because I think well-intentioned people have been misled into this position. But but you got to be careful with that, because you don't want to patronize or condescend. I mean, other people think that they have good reasons for where they're at, and even though we disagree, if we are perceived to be putting those people down or demeaning them, that is going to turn off people who just want to see mutual respect.
Okay.
I've only done one interview, and I had a nanosecond to get my points across.
Right.
And Paula Zahn asked me a stupid question, and I responded to her question, and it sucked up all my time. So
We're gonna talk this afternoon. Most of our discussion is going to be focusing on your messages.
great, thank you.
Yeah, that's going to be the bulk of our afternoon.
Rule number 1, be connected to the... We're going to let Marsha catch her breath for just a moment and give me a chance to introduce the gentleman who just flew in this morning, Mark Cushing.